Hey, this is Jake. You know, there's this old saying that goes, no power without accountability. I first heard it in a Billy Bragg song, but it's been around for years. And this week in my podcast, Battle Stories, I have a lesson for those of you in power who try to skirt accountability, and that is, you can't hide. This week I got a couple different stories about how those in power tried to essentially hide and how they were found out by community organizations. Now, an important part of this week's stories is these are actually some ongoing campaigns, and I've promised not to use particular names and target names and the names of the groups so that it doesn't jeopardize the work they're doing right now. One perfect example involved this group that was trying to put pressure on a local bank president of one of the major bank chains that you'd know, I'm sure you have in your town. Anyway, they wanted to, this bank president was ignoring them, and they wanted to take and put direct action pressure on him, so they had to find out where he lived. Now, as most people of the status of a bank president does, he had an unlisted phone number, and you can't just open up the phone book and look this guy up. So, this group went around, did some research, found what they believed to be his like home address, but they just weren't sure. So, there's a number of tricks that community organizing groups have to try to figure out, try to get confirmation on an address. So, what this one particular group did was, one of the staff picked up the phone, called the phone number that they suspected to be him, and basically pretended to be from a restaurant, Jason's Deli. And, in a lot of restaurants, a lot of delis, they have those little jars by the cash register that you can drop a business card in to win a free lunch. So the staff person calls up, gets a guy on the phone there, and says, "Is this Mr. John Doe?" And he's like, "Yeah." "Who's this?" And he's like, "Well, my name is Steve. I'm from Jason's Deli, and a couple weeks ago you dropped a business card in there, and I just need to confirm a couple things, because if this is you, then you've won a free lunch." And this guy got all excited. He's like, "Really? A free lunch? Wow, that's great." And he goes, "Well, let me just confirm a couple things with you. Your name is John Doe." He's like, "That's correct." And he's like, "You're the president of this bank?" And he's like, "Yep, that's correct. That's my business card." And she's like, "Okay, great. Well, I just need to mail you out your free lunch coupon thing, your gift certificate. And what's the home address that we can mail this to?" And then he just told us his home address. And they were able to, the next day, bring a busload of people and engage in a direct action there on his lawn that pressured them, the bank president, into signing this bank agreement, which ended some of their predatory lending practices in the neighborhood. I have one other similar story that I was involved in, but in order to do it justice, I have to set some of the backstory. This was about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, and this was in the evening, and I had been dating this really amazing girl for about 2 months. By that point, it's the same girl who later become my fiance now. And, she had spent a couple hours cooking this really beautiful home-prepared meal, and we had just sat down to it when my phone rang, and I answered it, and it was another group that does community organizing here in Kansas. And basically, they were all frantic. What had happened was they had as we were sitting there was this public meeting going on where there were like 400 concerned community members who all came together to try to get some resolution on this specific issue. And the target of the campaign, the people who could give them what they want, was this sort of mid-level state employee bureaucrat who had promised repeatedly that he was going to be at this meeting and that he was prepared to give them these things, which was going to be a huge accomplishment. Well, the meeting comes, and this guy's a no-show. And they wait, thinking maybe he's running late, and it becomes clear he's just not coming. So by the time I get the phone call, the staff is sort of frantic, saying, "Well, we can't let this guy stand us up. There's 300 people here who want to talk to him. We got to do something." So they frantically began to try to find his address to try to take the meeting to him, and they couldn't really come up with anything. It wasn't in any of their files, so they went to the phone book and they found a guy by the same name, but it just didn't feel right because he lived in a small town that was about 30 to 40 minutes away. Really small town. We're talking like 5,000 people live there, max. And it just didn't seem right that this guy would live in that kind of town. So, they got me I got this call and they asked me if I could help them look, see if we can find something. So, I tried, I dig through internet searches and I just couldn't find anything besides this small town address. So at that point in time, I sort of sit down and, I'm trying to figure out what to do. And I think Vanessa sort of saw what was in my mind. And, so I started to sit down and try to enjoy the meal. And she said, just go. And so I, kissed her on the forehead and ran out the apartment and jumped in the car and ended up driving down to this small town 40 miles away without even thinking about what I was doing. And so I get there, I get to this town, a nice little, picture Opie Taylor sort of idyllic small Midwestern town, nice little downtown area. I get to this guy's address and as soon as I sort of pull up by his house, I'm thinking like, what the hell am I going to say? Do I walk up to the door and say, excuse me, are you the guy who stood up this public meeting? Now, we couldn't do that. So we had to think of a covert way of finding out this information. So what I ended up doing is I drove around the block once or twice and noticed that there was this old couple, his neighbor, was sitting on the porch having a cigarette. And so I get out of the car and I walk up to him and I'm trying to think of any guys I can to try to figure out if their neighbor's the right guy. And so I walk up to him and say, hey, mind if I ask you guys a question? Is your neighbor, let's say John Doe 2? And they're like, I don't know. We've never talked to him. I'm like, man, because see, my dad is in the hospital and this was a really great friend of his and, he just wants to, reconnect with them, pretty soon. And they're like, well, we just don't know. And I'm like, well, he works for the state. Do you know, does your neighbor work for the state? And they're like, oh yeah. He works for the state. And then I asked a couple more questions and they sort of verified who this guy was. And so ran back to my car, jumped on the phone, called them and they said, that's it, we're on our way. It's about as best as you can get. Now, we had to try to be pretty sure because you don't want to have 300 people show up at the wrong guy's house. How do you apologize for that? That's like a pretty big oops moment. So anyway, cut a long story short, this caravan of cars form, like 60, 70 cars, over like 300 people in all, snaking down the highway, heading towards a small town. And so my job was to sort of establish the route they're going to go through town. And I get a call from one of the organizers who says, hey, Jake, help us figure out a path through town that they're not going to notice us and not tip us off. And I'm like, dude, the town has 5,000 people in it. There's no way. I don't think there's 70 cars in this town total. You can't just have a caravan of 70 cars go through town without somebody noticing. And and what ended up happening is, the cars came down. They ended up cutting through what had to be like a main street. And by the time they got to this guy's house, the police were there. Instead of going to the meeting, the guy sent a mole. And by the time we got to this guy's house, there were police cars there. So, instead of cutting this short, what became really cool is that the police made it very clear that if any of the cars stopped, there were going to be arrests made. So, what was beautiful is these 70 cars just started circling this guy's house and even honking the horn a couple times. And it drove this guy crazy and finally said, okay, fine, what do you guys want? And they sent a leadership team in to negotiate. But, that was just an amazing story to me about how quickly this community organization could react and mobilize it and still, get its people down there and win a victory. That this target thought he could shut down this meeting by not showing up, but instead the meeting went to them.